So take it away.
Can you see this? Does this work?
Yeah, perfect.
Great, cool. Well, yeah, thanks so much for having me today. Yeah, today's a little difficult day, but yeah, thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to be talking about some of the recent work we've been doing, thinking about human planning and human problem solving. And a big part of what motivates this work is kind of this observation that human cognition is kind of this very distinctively general and flexible, ability. And especially when we compare to other animals, for example, otters, they can do pretty sophisticated things. They can use tools, lions can cooperatively hunt and so on, but other species tend to be very specialized in types of behaviors, types of tasks they can do. And you can't get an otter to cooperatively hunt or get a lion to use tools. And similarly, most AI systems are also specialists. For example, AlphaGo really focuses on playing games, playing Go. Google Translate focuses on language. You can't get one to do the other. But of course, more recently, there's been a lot of work thinking about kind of generalist agents and large language models as kind of general models. But for the most part, AI systems are very specialized. They can do a single task. But a human being a single human being can do all of these tasks, and we can do many other tasks as well. A single person can use tools, we can cooperatively hunt, play games, use language. We can learn to do all of these things. We can switch between them and learn to do them very quickly. And so when thinking about this capacity or this capacity to do different things, be very general purpose, we can ask, okay, what are the mechanisms that support this? And of course, there are many mechanisms involved in human cognition, but a key mechanism that I think is not fully understood yet is this idea of planning. And people plan a lot in their everyday lives. We plan to get to, take the subway places. We plan how to cook meals. We plan when we play games. So planning is really a key part of cognitive flexibility in humans and our ability to kind of be general purpose in solving tasks. And planning has a very long history in psychology, as it does in computer science. So, going back to work by Tolman with rats and kind of studying kind of cognitive maps that they create. In the 60s, there was a lot of interest in kind of plans, and George Miller and colleagues developed these ideas about how plans as kind of a representation of an organism's behavior structures that behavior, and how kind of we aren't just kind of reacting, we're actually constructing these plans and executing them. And then of course, later on, Newell and Simon developed a computational formal theory of how humans solve novel problems and plan in their book, Human Problem Solving. And the kind of Newell and Simon approach to thinking about planning, as I'm sure a lot of people here are aware, is like kind of the basic model for thinking about planning. And so at a high level, the kind of two key things are going on. So first, you have a model of a task. So for example, in chess, you have a model of the pieces on the board, how they move, so on. And then given that model, or representation of a task, you do some kind of computation over it. For example, you search over different possible action sequences that you could take and try to find the best one. And maybe you're guided by some kind of heuristic when you're doing that. And so this is what I'm going to kind of broadly refer to as the standard model of planning. And the standard model of planning, which kind of differentiates between representing a task and then doing some kind of computations to solve that representation. This idea, I think we can find it in a lot of other ways of thinking about sequential decision making, for example, in reinforcement learning, MDPs, and so on. But a kind of funny thing about this model, and this was kind of known for a long time, even when it was being developed, is that the representation that's being used here it's generally a fixed representation. And there's always been a lot of evidence in psychology that people don't just work within a fixed representation of a problem, work on insight, work on analogy and expertise. These all kind of, a lot of this work before, during, and after Newell and Simon developed these ideas, kind of showed that people are really doing something more complicated when it comes to representing tasks. And for example, even in their time, there was this great set of studies where they would show experts who knew chess, they would show them a board and ask them to, they would record their eye movements as they were analyzing the board. And on the right is an example of this. And what's interesting about this is that people are not just kind of taking in the whole board, they're really selectively picking out certain details of the board. And so really their representation is not so much the full representation, but something like more what's on the right, a sparse representation of what's going on. And presumably they're thinking about only a subset of the interactions between the different pieces and not every possible interaction. So yeah, so there's kind of this old question that goes back to classic work on thinking about how humans solve problems, how humans plan. And the question is, where do task representations come from? How do we come up with these task representations for tasks as we're solving them? And our proposal is that we developed in this recent paper is this idea of what we're calling a value-guided construal, or a construal of a problem. I'll kind of get into the details of this model and how we're thinking about it, but I first want to talk a little bit about kind of the experimental setup that we use to study this type of thing in people. So to study this, we developed this maze navigation task, and it's pretty straightforward. The basic idea is that you control this little blue dot here, and the blue and black tile filled in tiles, they block you from moving, and otherwise you can move around to get to the goal. You're trying to get to this goal marked by a yellow tile. And on every trial, what would stay the same is this middle portion, this black cross in the middle. And what would change from trial to trial is your start location and your goal location, and the arrangement of these little Tetris-like pieces. And so a trial looks like this, where again, you kind of start, you have a blank trial or a blank screen with just the cross. And then when you're ready, you start, everything appears, then you navigate. And then afterwards, we want to get a sense of how are people representing, or what are they aware of in the task? And so we asked them for each obstacle, how aware of the highlighted obstacle were you at any point? And so we get a kind of judgment on a scale from 0 to 1 for each of these Tetris pieces. And the first thing to note about what's going on in this task is that people are planning and then they're acting on the task. You show them a maze, they don't have to kind of bumble around to figure out what's going on. They know, they understand it. We're kind of giving them the transition function, and they can plan over it, and then they execute the resulting plan. So in that sense, we're really trying to get at what kind of planning process is going on. And so we've really tried to minimize the amount of learning that's happening across trials. And again, the main kind of measure that we're trying to explain here is this kind of awareness response, or later on I'll talk about other types of measures. But for each obstacle in this maze, for example, we're getting a set of awareness responses from a bunch of participants. And what I'm showing you here is the kind of mean awareness response for each of these obstacles. And so this kind of gives you a sense of the map that people are kind of constructing in their heads as they're solving this problem. And so this is kind of the data that we're trying to explain, basically. How do we explain the kind of pieces here that people are paying attention to, or reporting paying attention to?
So just to make sure that I understand the setup here. So the person is trying to solve this maze, and essentially what this color coding shows is what cells in this grid people are paying attention as they complete this task.
Right. Yeah. We ask them after they complete it. And yeah, and we're a kind of key thing is that it's not like cell by cell. We're asking them kind of sets of cells, the Tetris pieces. But yeah.
And
so actually, sorry, go on.
Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up to that. You said that the pieces will move every single turn. Is it like a random motion? Like, can one of the L tetronimo basically move to any other random location? or are they like restricted to like move one tile at a time?
Sorry, yeah, maybe I wasn't clear. Yeah, so people navigate the whole thing and nothing is moving while they're navigating, but on each trial, they're getting a totally new arrangement of obstacles.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, it's not, we try to minimize, we're trying to make them each trial as independent as possible.
And they rate the awareness after each trial or at the end, after all experiments?
After they've navigated each maze.
Oh.
Did you have another question, Armando?
So I guess I wanted to hypothesize a little bit. So there are some obstacles here that are completely out of the way, that it's not surprising that they're not paying too much attention. I guess to me, the most surprising one is the one kind of to the left in the middle. Yeah, that one. Right?
Yeah.
So is the idea here that the one right above it is kind of catching all the attention because that's really the one that that is blocking your path?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it's like things like that, these kind of like weird discontinuities are kind of the key thing that we're trying to explain. And I'll show you some examples that I think really kind of highlight what we think is going on. Cool. So yeah, I guess I'll talk about the kind of the modeling now. So right, so kind of in the standard model plan, you kind of get a model of the task, then you plan over that model, then you take an action based on that. So it looks something like this with our maze. You get the task, you do some computation over it. So here I'm showing you the result of running like a star, basically, and it kind of, it has a heuristic, it knows the kind of direction to go in, and it, builds out its little graph, and then eventually finds a way to get to the goal. And then it executes the plan it gets. Our kind of proposal, what we're calling value guided construal, adds in this additional kind of process that's happening kind of in parallel / outside of the planning process that we're calling this construal process, kind of task construal formation. And so again, you're getting this kind of like ground truth model of the task, but rather than necessarily representing all the details of the task, you're representing a subset of details of the task. So for example, you could be ignored. So I'm showing you kind of the grayed out blocks represent ignoring the blocks, the Tetris blocks, whereas the blue represents paying attention to it. And so you get this model, you get a construal, and then you plan over that construal. So here I'm showing you kind of the result of running a planning algorithm on this and getting a plan. And so then you get a plan, and then you execute that plan in the environment. In this work, I'm gonna be assuming that basically the planning algorithm that we have is like kind of a black box. It's kind of an oracle that we choose a construal and we feed it to the planning algorithm, and then we get back the plan. And we're not going to think too much about what's happening inside the planning algorithm. That's very important, and I think something I'm happy to talk about. But for now, we're just assuming that it's just a black box. We don't really care about what the planning algorithm is. We're just getting the optimal solution given that we pass in a task construal. Okay, cool. So the way we're thinking about this then is kind of as a decision problem. And so this construal you can think of as a representation that you're choosing to solve the task with. And as a decision problem, we can kind of think of it in kind of utility decision theoretic terms, where there's a kind of value associated with different possible construals. And there are two factors that affect that value. One is the behavioral utility of that construal, and the other is the cognitive cost associated with that construal. And so I'll talk about kind of what I mean by construal here. And so so we assume that you're given kind of model the task, and then we're also assuming that this model is already parsed into a set of local interactions or kind of cause-effect relationships in the task. So for example, you have the cause-effect relationship associated with kind of the agent possibly colliding with this cross in the middle, and then you have another one associated with one of the Tetris blocks, and then you have ones associated with all the other Tetris blocks. So you have we're assuming that there's some kind of perceptual thing going on where you've already parsed it into a set of possible interactions. And then you select a subset of interactions. So for example, you definitely want this cross in the middle, and you don't necessarily want all of the blue Tetris blocks. Maybe you'll keep some of them and ignore some of them. And then you're going to take those and then compose those together, and then you get a construal. And so a key thing here is that we haven't done any planning yet, or we haven't assumed any planning yet. We've just assumed you have you parsed the world into some things, and you're constructing a construal, and now you have a kind of model that you can solve. And so we can take that construal and do planning over it. And so this pi c here kind of refers to the plan computed with the construal. So for example, if we have this construal on the left, we compute a plan, and it might tell you to take this path here in the middle. The problem though is that if you actually execute that plan in the real world, it's going to crash into one of the blocks. So it's not actually a good plan, and by extension, it's not actually a good construal. So this has a low utility. But we can change the construal. We can add in a new block, such as this one. And now when we plan with it, we get a new plan. If we execute that plan in the grid, in the actual grid, then we get to the goal. But the problem is that there's also this cognitive cost term. And there's a lot of ways to think about cognitive cost. We could think about the runtime of the algorithm, this planning algorithm or something like that, or some other kind of properties, or a budget or something like that. There's a lot of, I think this is an open question, like how do we think about cognitive costs with people in general? Here we just assumed a kind of description length cost on the construal itself. And so we kind of define this complexity of construal just in terms of the number of kind of effects that you're thinking about in your representation. So here, this is just the number of blocks you're going to think about. And so from that perspective, this construal on the left is actually not very good, because you kind of have all these extraneous details. For example, these two obstacles right here. And so if we remove those, we can replan, we get a new plan, we execute that plan, and it's a good plan. So this plan has a high utility, and it has it's kind of the minimal construal, given the assumptions about kind of the kind of primitives of the construal language in this case. And so a kind of popping up a level, a way to think about this is that, or a way I think about this is that construal selection is really a meta-optimization problem. And by that, I mean that planning is an optimization problem. You get a problem, you solve it, you find an optimal plan. And then the construal is kind of meta-optimization, because you're kind of feeding different possible task representations into the planning algorithm. And so we can think of it as kind of meta-optimization that kind of formally is not so different from something like meta-learning, but I think is interesting because the way it's happening here in this kind of task is that it's kind of happening all internally. And so, okay, so we have our data, we have this model, and for this the grid I've been kind of walking us through, we get this prediction, and we can compare it to people's responses. So this is people's responses on this grid, and if we look at some of the other grids, they look similarly. So this was the one I kind of showed at the beginning, and you can see there's a nice kind of relationship between these two. And just to kind of make that more precise, the first analysis I'm going to talk about now is just kind of looking at all of the obstacles here that were predicted to be ignored, and then looking at what people's awareness responses were for that. And if we do that, we can see that on average, people tended to, report less awareness on these obstacles, on the obstacles that were predicted to be ignored. And conversely, the ones that were predicted to be included in the construal tend to get higher awareness scores. And this is a significant interaction, or a significant relationship. So to kind of like build some intuition for what's going on here, I'm going to kind of walk through an example involving crossing a bridge. So I want you to imagine, so this is New Orleans, and in New Orleans, there's this long bridge that goes across this lake here. And you can imagine being on the south side of the lake, you're trying to get to the north side of the lake. And on a normal day, you would just cross the bridge. It's the shortest route. But now imagine that there's a truck blocking the bridge. You find out on the news that there's a truck blocking the bridge. Now you're going to take a different route. You're going to go this way. But what's interesting is that this truck actually plays a very key role in your representation of like kind of coming up with a plan to solve the problem. If I asked you, is there a truck on the bridge, after you thought about this, you'd be like, yeah, of course there is. That's why I went this way. But you wouldn't necessarily think about the stuff in between the truck and where you are. And so this is kind of illustrating that we can kind of disentangle this kind of low-level perceptual feature of just distance from this idea of kind of relevance that the model is picking up on. So we can kind of construct a grid. So we basically constructed grids, these critical mazes that have this kind of property of the truck example that I was talking about, where if this is the optimal path or one of the optimal paths to get to the destination, you have some obstacles that are relevant to your path, but very close to the path you end up taking. And then you also have an obstacle, a lot like the truck, that's very far from the path, but relevant to what you end up doing. And similarly, or kind of conversely, you have these irrelevant obstacles that are maybe some of which are close to the path, but aren't really relevant for the plan you end up coming with in this scenario. And so for this experiment, we kind of changed it a little bit. We had it so that we kind of encourage people to plan up front by removing the obstacles when they were executing, so they couldn't look at the obstacles, so they couldn't plan while they were acting. This is just to kind of separate as much as possible planning from execution. And then as a result of the kind of design of these new grids, we were able to use these recall probes, where instead of asking for the awareness results, we gave people 2 obstacles, one of which was actually in the task that they just did. And we asked them which one was actually in the task you did and how confident are you? And so that if kind of people's memory is reflecting their awareness, attention during planning, this should pick up on what they were aware of. And so again, on the left, I'm showing you these kinds of different types of obstacles. And the kind of key thing is that the green ones are the things that the model predicts are relevant, and the red ones are the ones that it predicts are irrelevant. And for both accuracy and mostly for confidence, we find that these 2 things come apart according to the model. Okay, so yeah, so that's kind of the main experimental results. I think a key thing here is that we want to compare also to some alternative mechanisms that could be going on. Even in this super simple maze task, there's a lot of things happening when people are looking and thinking about them. People are perceiving the maze, they have to perceive the maze, they have to break it down into different pieces, they do planning, and they're executing. We wanted to test a bunch of different alternative models to see whether kind of value-guided construal was uniquely explaining what's going on here. So again, the value-guided construal model, it predicts that you're going to pay attention to these in this case. But we also tested 2 heuristic search algorithms. So the first was real-time dynamic programming, and on a real-time dynamic programming, given a heuristic, works something like this. It kind of rolls out repeatedly different possible trajectories, and then it updates value function based on where it's explored. And there are lots of different ways to kind of make that more efficient, but the basic idea is that you're rolling out things from some start state. And on our task, so that's what it looks like on kind of a 4 rooms type thing. On our task, it ends up doing something like this, or on these critical mazes, it ends up doing something like this, where first it kind of goes over here, kind of searches around, a bunch, and then it goes up here, searches around a bunch, and has to kind of repeatedly, once it's done that, then it's kind of able to really properly figure out what's going on and kind of plan a path to the goal. And so we can use this algorithm to derive predictions for what people would be doing if they were doing a kind of trajectory-based search process on the kind of ground truth model of the task. Oops. And so it looks something like this, where if this thing is rolling out a bunch, we can kind of count whenever it hits one of these obstacles. And we took the log of that because, as you saw, I kind of spent a lot of time over here. And so we wanted to kind of normalize that in some way. The other thing we did was look at a kind of graph-based heuristic search algorithm, something more like A star. We used LAO star because this was modeled as an MVP. And in that case, LAO star does something similar. It kind of is building a graph, but it's rolling out from the beginning, building a graph to plan over. And getting to the goal. Oh yeah. Is there a question? Yeah, so we can similarly look at the kind of hit count here induced by the graph that results from this planning process, and similarly get a kind of score for each how many times this algorithm tends to hit these different obstacles. Okay, so we have these two kind of alternative measures, alternative predictors for these different obstacle awareness responses. And okay, weird. And these are like kind of search-based planning algorithms. We also looked at some other kind of representational processes that have been proposed in the literature, and then also a bunch of kind of perceptual features and landmarks that are related to that you can kind of just calculate from the grid. So for example, like the minimum path, the distance from an obstacle to the path you took, the distance of an obstacle from the goal, the distance of an obstacle from the start, and so on. And so we have all these predictors, and what we did was we took them all and we fit them a single global model to all the recall responses. And then we fit another model where we removed each one. And then we compared the global model to the kind of lesions model. And the idea here is that we're kind of testing the necessity of that particular predictor for explaining people's responses in this task. And so what I'm going to show you here is the kind of change in fit resulting from removing each of these regressors. So the first one is value guided construal. If we remove that, we lose a lot of ability to fit the data. If we remove these kind of planning and representation based things, we don't lose quite as much. And similarly, if we remove the kind of perceptual landmark based ones, we don't lose quite as much.
So I have a question. So in that plot, so does that plot say that removing the value guided construal takes the predictive power of the model over the responses?
Exactly.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Mark, I have a question over the equation. Yeah, just go to the next slide.
Oh yeah.
So what is the intuition behind this equation? How did you come up with this? The cost, and I mean, for me, just trying to understand how. I mean, it seems to be very powerful, right, for the modeling that you're doing. But I'm just wondering how you arrived to this form.
Yeah. So there's a lot of work now in cognitive science, kind of thinking about so this kind of general idea of kind of factoring the cost of some kind of cognitive operation into its utility and like the cost of running it or calculating it. This is something that people have been doing for like a while now, and it's picking up. So a lot of people in the group I'm in have been thinking about this under the heading of resource rationality. It's basically a way to formalize the idea of a bounded rationality, but in a way that kind of gives you like an optimality kind of criterion, and not just kind of saying, okay, here's an algorithm that works okay and solves the problem okay, but actually kind of gives us a way to more precisely quantify the trade-off between the cost of calculating something and its utility for action or whatever. Yeah, so that's where the kind of two pieces came from. The kind of having this over something like the task representation, that's kind of, yeah, where did that come from? I guess, yeah, that was the idea. I mean, like, people have thought about task representations a lot. And so our kind of approach was to say, okay, can we think about this in a resource rational way? Can we think about this as a kind of trade-off between these different factors? Yeah. Yeah. So right. So this kind of basic model that I was talking about, it assumes kind of at the beginning of a trial, you're just choosing a single construal, planning with it, and then using it. But one thing we were curious was whether, is there a kind of more dynamic way of thinking about this construal process that could capture or explain more of the variability in people's responses. And so the idea here was to allow for a kind of construal updating during the planning process, where we kind of define a dynamics over different states and construals that, and that's represented here, that you're kind of computing a value function over, and then the construals we see, the kind of results we see, are a result of kind of optimizing this type of thing. And so the kind of basic idea here is that rather than thinking of the construal as kind of one-off thing, you're kind of changing it over time, and that change is kind of is modulated by a cost in terms of switching, adding in new details, adding in new effects. And so that prevents this whole thing from just saying, okay, I'm going to think about the task this way in this state, and then totally change my representation at the next state. This kind of forces it to have some continuity in its representation over time, or for related states. And so this value function gives us a construal switching policy, which we can examine and see if it corresponds to people's, how people are representing the task. So what I'm going to show you here is the kind of expected maze actions resulting from this type of policy, without showing anything about the construal. So here it's just kind of moving through the task, or taking, these are the different steps of the plan. And now I'm going to show you kind of at each state what the construal associated with that state is. And so here, it's kind of moving up and it's paying attention to these two. Once it passes this, it's not paying attention to this anymore and pays more attention to this. But then once it passes this, it kind of stops paying attention to this one. So that happened very fast, but basically the idea here is that kind of for these states here, a construal that involves these two obstacles is more likely. Once you're past this, so it's kind of as if these two obstacles kind of form a room, and like getting out of this room is what you need to know. You need to know that there's a room, and you need to know that you need to get out of it. And then once you're out of the room, you're thinking about this room over here, and really you don't care about what's going on over here anymore because you're just trying to get to the goal. And so you think about this obstacle, but then once you're past it, it's just a straight shot to get to the goal. And so this gives us a way to think about the kind of dynamic construal that might be going on. So again, we can kind of clump that even more and kind of collapse like the expected construal or attention to each of these obstacles that you would get. And this becomes another predictor that we can compare to human judgments. And so this is for the initial experiment that I showed you, the original model, which proposes you're only doing a single construal. This one, it assigns either 0 or 1 to each. It mostly assigns 0 or 1 to each obstacle. And so I'm just highlighting those as the gray and blue ones here. And this is the, so the x-axis is the prediction of the model, and the y-axis are the awareness judgments for each item. And if we take into account this kind of dynamic process, it begins to capture a bit more of the continuous variance in people's responses, but mainly for the blue ones, mainly for the things that are supposed to be paid attention to. So it kind of gives us a finer grain prediction for attention to the things you're going to pay attention to, this model, this kind of dynamic model. And this particular one used a fixed set of parameters. But if we fit those parameters, which is this next one over here, we get an even better fit. And then actually, if we kind of add in certain biases into the plan, in all the models I've discussed so far, we assume that you kind of get a construal and then you're kind of planning optimally in it. Here, we're assuming that maybe you have some bias in your plan. So for example, we observed that people, they tended to want to stay closer to the edge of the maze. They tended to, really not like bumping into walls. And so if we add those kinds of biases into the planning process, into the kind of action level plan, then we find that we can actually capture a bit more of the variance in what people are doing. But the kind of key thing is that this value guided construal, even this simple kind of single value guided construal thing continues to capture this kind of at a high level, the kind of divergence between the different types of obstacles. And if we did a similar kind of analysis with this critical maze experiment that I talked about, and we find similarly we can improve on how we explain what people did, what people are paying attention to. Okay, cool. So I'm going to kind of shift gears a little bit, but was that all? Any questions at this point?
I just have a question about the assumptions that you made in terms of the people. I mean, how do you assume that everyone is highly functional, a certain age, which sex, or what is the kind of assumptions for the people that are solving these kind of tasks?
Yeah, I mean, so we ran this online with a prolific sample. So they're mostly, they were all participants from the US and the UK, because that's what we had protocol for, like an IRB protocol for. Otherwise, there weren't really any constraints. They just needed to have a computer and be on.
Because for example, my question is, for example, if someone has a problem like ADHD or some, I don't know, any kind of cognitive process problem, would that reflect here somehow in the results?
Yeah. That's really interesting. So that's a question I'm very interested in. I don't think we have the data. We didn't ask people about that kind of thing, so we weren't able to look at that. But yeah, I mean, this is like we're kind of proposing an attentional process here, and it's a goal-directed attentional process. And so potentially this could be a way to kind of operationalize or kind of make more precise what's happening in those kinds of attentional disorders. Yeah, I don't have an answer right now, but maybe in a couple of years. Yeah.
Okay.
So I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So one way of explaining the saliency of the obstacles is by changing the value of the construal variable. And another way of explaining that change in saliency may be related to the utility associated with the nodes in the graph. Like, for example, obstacles that are close to a point, to a state that has, high utility are going to be more salient. Do you have any thoughts about distinguishing between those two explanations?
Yeah, so I think for the second thing you mentioned, this analysis spec, the analysis back here with the kind of comparisons was designed to get at some of that, if I understand you correctly. So like the goal, for example, is a very high utility state, and maybe you're just really paying attention to what's happening around the goal. This predictor here is basically that. And so what we find is that that's not very predictive of what people say they're paying attention to. Just like being close to the goal, it kind of has to be related to a goal in a way that has to do with how you're going to plan to get to the goal, which is what our model is getting at.
I see.
Is that, yeah. And then your second point about, the kind of cost of the construal. So yeah, so right now we're assuming a pretty simple cost, but you could enrich it in various ways. You could add kind of like I said, we aren't thinking very much about how you plan over a representation, giving a representation, but you might have costs associated with that. We didn't need to fit like a kind of weight, just because the structure of our tasks we didn't have to fit a weight on the particular cognitive cost that we did use, because the costs are just like, if you're thinking of an obstacle, if you're not thinking of an obstacle and it's in the way, it's really bad because you're just going to crash into it. And so we didn't need to do too much fitting there, but like I think in more complex domains, we have to think more carefully about, okay, how are people, like what is the cost relative to the utility? There's like a trade-off that we have to think harder about in domains where there's a kind of less obvious trade-off, I guess.
Right. I see. Yeah. So my question was like trying to get at the point that people could be updating the construals, but they could also be updating the utility function, and that may be another way to explain that. But I think this plot basically accounts for that in some sense. Yeah.
I mean, we tried to keep the utility function constant because you like throughout a trial, they're always trying to get to the goal.
Yeah.
Cool. Any other questions on this stuff? Okay, cool. So yeah, I guess so. In the remaining, I guess I'll try to go quickly through this, and we can talk more maybe. But a kind of direction that I'm particularly interested in is kind of thinking about this idea of functional fixedness, which is an old topic in psychology that I think is very relevant for thinking about planning and human planning. And so the kind of classic example of this is what's called the candle task. And I'm not sure if people are familiar with this. If you're not, maybe take a second and think about this. So what happens in this experiment is you bring people into the lab and you tell them, here's a book of matches, here's a box of tacks, and here's a candle. And your goal is to attach the candle to the wall somehow and light it. And so you have to use these objects somehow. So maybe take a second and imagine how you do that. When you bring participants in to do this, they try things like trying to melt the candle to the wall or tacking the candle, kind of taking the candle and tacking it. But the right answer, or the most effective answer, is to actually empty out the box of tacks and then tack the box to the wall and then put the candle in the box and then light the candle. And this is often thought of as a problem with the task representation. And this is one of those results that kind of causes problems for the classical way of thinking about planning. Because it's as if like it's not that you're not planning, it's that you're planning in a wrong representation of the task. You're not thinking about the box as a kind of shelf that you can put the candle on. You're thinking about it as a box, as a container for the tax, and that blocks you from thinking about it as a kind of shelf. And so our framework allows us to start thinking about these types of problems in a more rigorous way. And in particular, we are starting to study this by thinking about kind of learning different ways of construing a problem. So for example, in this, we developed this new set of mazes where they were made up of, again, the black kind of bars that were fixed. and then these blocks that were these 3x3 blocks that could move around. But unlike in the other task, they had a bit more complicated structure to them. So they could have little pieces broken off that were not going to block you. So the lighter parts are not going to block you, and the darker parts continue to work as obstacles. And what this induces is kind of two sets of construals that you could apply to any maze. One is what you can think of as a coarse-grained construal, where you're kind of only thinking about the blocks as blocks and not thinking about the smaller structure in them. And so, for example, on this maze, if you thought about it at a coarse-grained level and only thought about the blocks, you could solve it. But if we move this block up here and you continue to think about it in a coarse-grained way, then you're not going to be able to solve it. What you need to do is think about it in a fine-grained way and think about one of these notches and how it'll let you get to the goal, kind of take a back alley to get to the goal. So again, we have these kind of like two sets of construals that we can think about. And so we designed an experiment where we tried to get people to kind of get stuck in one or the other of these construal sets. And so we either trained people on a bunch of mazes where you could just solve it using a coarse-grained construal, or you could solve it, or a set of mazes where you had to solve it using a fine-grained construal. And then afterwards, we gave people the same set of critical mazes where these were kind of carefully designed so that there was either a fine-grained solution or a coarse-grained solution, but the coarse-grained solution was worse, behaviorally worse. And so you needed to kind of, if you were only thinking about it coarse-grained way, you would kind of take this longer route to get to the goal. And what we found was that this kind of functional fixedness thing, where if you were trained on the coarse-grained mazes, then you were way less likely to take the best route. But if you were trained on the fine-grained mazes, you did take the best route because of the way you're construing the problem. Even though for both sets of participants, they kind of have the same representation in front of them. What's different is that they've been kind of trained to kind of form an attentional schema or representation of the problem that prevents them from solving it in the best way. And then we find that this kind of effect actually persists for a while and to a certain extent gets overcome. And so we can kind of think of this as a kind of construal set selection process on top of this, this process of choosing a task construal and planning. And in this setting, what's happening is this kind of slower process of learning a construal set or learning what construal set to use, and then this faster process of using a construal, planning, trying a different construal in that construal set and planning and so on. And what's kind of neat about this is that we can actually get at kind of ideas related to not just like procedural aspects of habits, like I take the same action over and over again, but something like conceptual habits where you're kind of stuck in a way of thinking about a problem. And even if you're trying to solve that problem, you're actively trying to solve that problem, you may be stuck in a particular way of thinking about it, so you can't come up with the best plan. Yeah, so just to kind of wrap up, the idea that we are trying to develop here is a framework for thinking about human planning that incorporates some of these representational processes. And the kind of way I like to distinguish what's going on here is that you can typically, we think about, you're given a model and then you're kind of computing actions. You're kind of selecting what actions to take. The idea here is that in addition to that, you are kind of selecting how to represent the problem. And so somehow these two things in people are going on and kind of begin to explain some of these issues, such as what Simon and Newell and people in the problem solving literature have called things like the problem with problem spaces. Kind of like, where does the state space, where does the problem model that you're using, where does that come from? And from a cog-sci perspective, there's this kind of question of normative, like what is the kind of computational level problem that's being solved, versus algorithmic, which is what's the particular algorithm being used to solve this problem. And so what I presented was essentially a normative model. It's a kind of assumption about how the planning computations are separated into this representational part and this action selection part. But it's normative in that it assumes kind of things are happening optimally. It asks, okay, what is the optimal thing given some computational cost and desire to solve the task? An algorithmic model would begin to get at, okay, how is that optimal solution actually found? And in the supplemental material of the paper, we discuss a little bit efficient algorithms for construal selection, and essentially you can think of it as like a kind of a search process over construals as opposed to just over actions. But this is very preliminary, and I think there's a lot of interesting ideas there. And I think, yeah, kind of thinking more about kind of how do human algorithms for planning differ from what have classically been thought of as machine planning algorithms, classical search algorithms. I think maybe part of the reason why there's been less focus on thinking about the representational part of things has to do with machines are very good at just kind of chugging through a lot of possible action sequences, whereas people have trouble imagining like lots of detailed actions, like imagining like a big tree of actions. And yeah, so future directions that I think would be exciting to think about are one, the kind of representation learning problem, which is where do these kind of Tetris pieces, kind of representations of like composable representations of the task, where do they even come from? How can we learn them? And then also scaling to more complicated domains where we're not kind of hard coding the different representations. And we've thought a little bit about how you might do that with a lot of existing tools, things like neural networks, program induction, or maybe all of the above. I think the framework, the way we're thinking about this is agnostic to particular algorithm at the moment, but maybe some types of algorithms, architectures are better than others for this particular type of problem. And then thinking about kind of human-machine interaction, if humans are thinking about solving problems in this particular way, that's very useful to know if you're going to design a machine that's trying to, say, infer human intentions, do inverse reinforcement learning or inverse planning. Cool. So I want to thank my collaborators on this work, Tom Griffiths, John Cohen, Michael Littman, Dave Abel, and Carlos Correa. And thank you all for listening, and happy to answer any questions.
I have a question. That's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It's great. So one thing I didn't hear you say much is abstraction. So when I think about these problems, like to me, the core question is how do we abstract things in the world? And so I wonder if there's a meaningful distinction between abstraction and what you're calling representation or task selection. And then maybe a more concrete question is, when we think about how to abstract or how to represent the world, there's both there's a sense in which maybe like we could construct an abstraction or representation and then use that, or maybe that abstraction has to be relative to the particular query or question that we have in mind. And so I just wanted to hear if you had any thoughts about those high level questions.
Yeah, definitely. So I think a lot of this work was originally inspired by thinking about abstraction and thinking about how do people form abstract representations of tasks. And in a way, it is an abstract representation of a task, but I think what we realized was that to get at this, we can actually get at this process of what we're calling construal without getting into abstraction per se, or necessarily. But I don't know, a way to think about abstraction, a way to think about what we're posing. Well, so I think there are a couple ways in which is different from just abstraction, which I think is like the umbrella term maybe for what's going on here. One is that it's abstraction about the transition function in a way. It's kind of assuming that you're removing certain details about how things are going to interact with other things. So a kind of way to think about what's happening in the mazes is that you're not thinking about what would happen if you crashed into a certain obstacle because it's just not relevant for your current plan or your current query. So I kind of think of it as a kind of form of transition function abstraction or program abstraction, if you think of a transition function as a program. And then, the other thing I would say is that, what I think is kind of a big focus here is thinking about how is this capacity happening very rapidly? And kind of, it's not just something that's happening like we kind of optimize a representation and then feed it to a planner, but it's actually arguably with people, most of what's happening when they are planning is abstraction. I don't have like evidence for that yet, but I think intuitively a lot of what people are doing is kind of forming the right abstractions at the right time, and it's much less kind of stepping through a representation the way like a heuristic search algorithm would most of the time. And so so I think it's kind of like definitely, and so I think a lot of the machinery involved in thinking about abstraction, kind of factored MVPs and stuff like that can be used here, but part of the idea is to think, okay, how do we like kind of shift the focus to that process and away from like the search over it per se, if that makes sense.
But as a quick follow-up, so in your example, I think you had one, like in the latter example, you had the coarse-grained representation, which was, as far as I understood, like more like a bounding box around the kind of the finer grained geometry. So if I plan with a coarse-grained representation and I fail, and like, how do I know that it's because of my representation or it's because the problem is not solvable?
Solvable.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I guess so definitely that work is trying to step more towards abstraction, I think, in the classic sense of abstraction. But I do think, I think this is a problem that I think that's actually a very like thing that people face a lot, where like they don't have the right way to represent the problem, and so they assume it's not solvable, or they're not able to solve it, and so they give up. So like there are people in the like functional fixedness task who just never solve the problem and assume that you can't solve it, that it's a trick question or something like that. So I think that those are compatible.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Is there some chat? Okay, cool.
All right, anyone else, or are we all set?